Last time, we looked at basic hormone structures, classifications, and effects. Today, we will be applying this knowledge to one of the most important complexes in the entire body, the hypothalamus-pituitary complex. Together, the hypothalamus of the brain and the pituitary gland control most of the body's responses. And all of this occurs in an area roughly the size of a green bean. Let's begin our investigation of this complex by looking a little more closely at the gland involved. The pituitary gland sits in the sphenoid bone of the skull. It is roughly the size and shape of a pea on a pea stalk. Yet, despite its small size, this is one of the most important glands in the human body, and it releases at least 8 hormones. We divide the gland into posterior and anterior lobes. The posterior lobe is composed largely of neural tissue and releases neurohormones, or hormones secreted by neurons. This is a hormone storage area for hormones made in the hypothalamus, just superior to the pituitary. The posterior lobe, therefore, is not a true endocrine gland that is responsible for actually manufacturing hormones. The anterior pituitary lobe is composed of glandular tissue that does release hormones. We will discuss these hormones in more detail after taking a look at the posterior pituitary. The difference between the two lobes of the pituitary is in their different tissues. Just in case you didn't believe me back in Chapter 3 when I told you that the type of tissue in an organ was important. The posterior lobe is actually made of neural tissue. It's part of the brain. During development, tissue from the hypothalamus grows inferiorly and maintains its neural connection with the hypothalamus via a nerve bundle called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, which runs through the infundibulum, or the stalk connecting the pituitary to the hypothalamus. This tract develops from neurons in the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei. These are neurosecretory cells that synthesize one of 2 neurohormones and transports them via their axons down into the posterior pituitary. When these hypothalamic neurons fire, they release the stored hormones into the capillary bed in the posterior pituitary. These capillaries are blood vessels that can easily facilitate the diffusion of substances into and out of the bloodstream by having thinner walls than other vessels. Looking more closely at the neurosecretory cells from the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei allows us to determine which hormones are being released by which cells. The paraventricular neurons primarily make oxytocin, and the supraoptic neurons mainly produce antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Remember, these hormones are just stored in the axons of the neurons from the hypothalamus and are only released into the capillary beds of the posterior pituitary when the neurons fire. Oxytocin and ADH are almost identical molecules. Each are amino acid-based hormones with a 9 amino acid sequence. They differ only by 2 of those amino acids. However, despite their similar structures, they have dramatically different physiological effects. Oxytocin is a strong stimulant of uterine contraction and is released in significantly higher amounts during childbirth. Throughout a pregnancy, the number of oxytocin receptors in the uterus increases and finally peaks near the end of the pregnancy. The smooth muscle walls in the uterus therefore become more and more sensitive to the hormone's stimulatory effects. So, as the uterus stretches and the cervix stretches as the baby drops and is ready to be born, afferent impulses to the hypothalamus increase and oxytocin is released to stimulate contractions of the uterus. Oxytocin also acts as the hormonal trigger for milk ejection in women whose breasts are producing milk in response to another hormone called prolactin. When a baby suckles, a reflex-initiated release of oxytocin targets specialized myoepithelial cells surrounding the milk-producing glands. These cells then contract and force milk from the breast and into the infant's mouth. Both labor and milk ejection are examples of positive feedback mechanisms. Antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, prevents wide swings in water balance, helping the body avoid dehydration and water overload. A certain type of hypothalamic neurons, called osmoreceptors, continuously monitor the solute concentration of the blood. When solutes threaten to become too concentrated, which could happen after you sweat a lot or after you don't drink enough water, the osmoreceptors transmit excitatory impulses to the hypothalamic neurons, which release ADH. ADH then targets the kidney tubule cells, causing them to reabsorb water from the forming urine and returning it to the bloodstream. Drinking alcoholic beverages inhibits ADH secretion and causes a lot of urine output. The dry mouth and intense thirst of a hangover reflect this dehydrating effect. Now let's take a look at the anterior pituitary. Unlike the posterior lobe, the anterior lobe originates from epithelial tissue as an outpocket of the oral mucosa. After touching the posterior lobe, the anterior lobe adheres to it and loses its original connection to the oral mucosa. Notice there is no direct neural connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior lobe, but there is a vascular connection. These vascular connections allow releasing and inhibiting hormones secreted by neurons in the hypothalamus to circulate down to the anterior pituitary, where they regulate the secretion of its hormones. This direct connection allows those releasing and inhibiting hormones of the hypothalamus to arrive quickly at the anterior pituitary without being diluted by having to circulate through the entire body. The anterior pituitary used to be referred to as the master endocrine gland because many of the numerous hormones it produces regulate the activity of other endocrine glands. Recently, however, its title has been taken by the hypothalamus, which is now known to control the activity of the anterior pituitary. When the anterior pituitary receives an appropriate chemical stimulus from the hypothalamus, it releases one or more of its hormones, which we will now examine in greater detail. Somatotropic cells of the anterior lobe produce growth hormone, or GH. This hormone is essentially an anabolic, or tissue-building hormone that has both metabolic and growth-promoting actions. Growth hormone plays multiple roles in the direct regulation of metabolism, some similar and others drastically different. This allows growth hormone to play a role in multiple situations that can occur in the body. Some of its effects are as follows. It is responsible for mobilizing fats from fat depots in the body for transport to cells. This increases blood levels of fatty acids and encourages tissues to use the fats for fuel. Growth hormone is also responsible for decreasing the rate of glucose uptake and metabolism, conserving the body's store of glucose. It can also break down glycogen stores in the liver to increase blood glucose. Growth hormone also mediates most of its growth-enhancing effects indirectly via a family of growth-promoting proteins called insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. Many tissues throughout the body release these IGFs in response to growth hormone. The IGFs stimulate two actions required for growth. The first is the uptake of nutrients from the blood and their incorporation into proteins and DNA, allowing growth by cell division. They also stimulate the formation of collagen and the deposition of bone matrix. The secretion of growth hormone is mostly regulated by two hypothalamic hormones, growth hormone releasing hormone, or GHRH, which stimulates the release of growth hormone, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone, GHIH, which inhibits growth hormone release. Typically, growth hormone secretion has a daily cycle with the highest levels occurring during evening sleep. The total amount secreted daily peaks during adolescence and then declines with age. As you can see in this flowchart, there are many other factors besides GHRH and GHIH that can stimulate or inhibit the release of growth hormone. Study this table found on page 608 of your textbook to understand the overall effects growth hormone can have on the body when released. Thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, is a tropic hormone, meaning it regulates the secretory action of other endocrine glands. This hormone stimulates the normal development and secretory activity of the thyroid gland, which we will discuss next time. The hypothalamic peptide, thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH, triggers the release of TSH from the thyrotropic cells of the anterior pituitary. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, is secreted by the corticotropic cells in the anterior pituitary. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to release corticosteroid hormones, most importantly, glucocorticoids that help the body resist certain stressors. ACTH, like growth hormone, has a daily rhythm, although its levels peak in the morning shortly before waking. Rising levels of glucocorticoids feed back and block the secretion of the corticotropin-releasing hormone that is responsible for stimulating the release of ACTH. Follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, or FSH and LH, are referred to as gonadotropins. These regulate the function of the gonads, also known as the ovaries and testes. In both genders, FSH stimulates the production of gametes, being sperm or eggs, and LH promotes the production of gonadal hormones. In females, LH works with FSH to cause an egg-containing ovarian follicle to mature. LH then continues on to trigger ovulation and promote the creation and release of ovarian hormones. In males, LH stimulates the interstitial cells of the testes to produce the male hormone testosterone. Both of these hormones are rarely found in the blood of children that have not yet gone through puberty. During puberty, the gonadotropic cells of the anterior pituitary are activated and gonadotropin levels rise, causing the gonads to mature. Prolactin is the last anterior pituitary secreted hormone. It is very structurally similar to growth hormone. Prolactin's only well-documented effect in humans is to stimulate the milk production by the breasts. Its role in males is not well understood yet, but it has still been found in male bloodstreams. Prolactin is unique from every other anterior pituitary hormone because its release is controlled mainly by an inhibitory hormone called prolactin inhibitory hormone, which we also now know as dopamine, the neurotransmitter. Decreased prolactin inhibitory hormone secretion leads to more prolactin being released. In females, prolactin levels rise and fall in rhythm with estrogen blood levels. Estrogens, which will be covered next time, stimulate prolactin release both directly and indirectly. Make sure that you spend a good amount of time studying each of these hormones. This table, found on pages 606 and 607 of your textbook, will be a useful guide in your study. Also key to understanding in this section is how the hypothalamus controls the hormones secreted from both the posterior pituitary lobe and the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Why is the hypothalamus considered the master endocrine gland? Make sure you can answer that question.